dark castles, whispered rumors, and a name that still chills the imagination. Elizabeth Bathory. History knows her as the Blood Countess, a woman accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young girls, bathing in their blood, and becoming what many believe to be the first true serial killer in recorded history. But who was she really? Was she a monster who terrorized her people, or was she a victim of politics, her life twisted into legend by enemies eager to seize her wealth and land? To understand Elizabeth Bathory, we must step back into the late 16th century, a time when the Kingdom of Hungary was torn between Christian Europe and the rising Ottoman Empire. It was a land of endless wars, shifting alliances, and noble families desperate to hold on to their power. In this brutal world, cruelty was not unusual. But even by those standards, the accusations against one noblewoman would shock Europe for centuries. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful aristocratic families in Hungary. She grew up in privilege, surrounded by servants, wealth, and the harsh lessons of noble life. As a child, she would have witnessed both refinement and violence, executions of criminals, punishments for peasants, and the strict discipline of noble courts. These early experiences, along with her powerful family's traditions, may have shaped the woman she became. From the outside, she seemed destined for greatness. Elizabeth was intelligent, educated in multiple languages, and married into another influential family, cementing her status as one of the most powerful women in the region. She lived in the imposing fortress of Zefte Castle, surrounded by riches and servants. To her neighbors, she was untouchable. But in the shadows of her castle walls, whispers began. Stories of young girls disappearing, peasants who spoke of screams echoing at night, rumors that Elizabeth was not merely a noblewoman, but something darker, a predator. Over the centuries, those whispers grew into one of the most terrifying legends of European history. Is not capable of medical stuff for the faint and is found? In this story, we will walk through the life and legacy of Elizabeth Bathory, from her childhood in one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, to the horrific accusations that earned her a place in history as the world's first female serial killer. And by the end, you will have to decide for yourself, was Elizabeth Bathory truly the Blood Countess, a monster in human form, or a victim of the legend, punished more by myth than by her own crimes? To understand the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, we must first understand the world she was born into. The late 16th century was a time of blood, faith, and endless conflict. Hungary, Elizabeth's homeland, was torn between two great powers. On one side, the Christian kingdoms of Europe. On the other, the expanding Ottoman Empire. War was constant. Raids burned villages, soldiers marched endlessly, and the nobility held their power by both sword and fear. It was in this violent and unstable environment that Elizabeth entered the world in 1560. She was born into the House of Bathory, one of the most influential and feared families in Central Europe. The Bathorys were no ordinary nobles. They were rulers, generals, and princes. Her cousin Stephen Bathory would go on to become the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Transylvania. The family's name carried weight and authority, and young Elizabeth was raised with the knowledge that her bloodline was both powerful and dangerous. From an early age, Elizabeth was given privileges few women of her time could dream of. Unlike most noble women, She received a proper education. She learned to read and write in Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. She studied etiquette, religion, and even elements of science. In a world where most peasants could not even write their own names, Elizabeth stood apart as a woman of intelligence and refinement. Yet refinement did not mean kindness. In 16th century Hungary, cruelty was stitched into daily life. Executions were public spectacles. Peasants were whipped, mutilated, or even burned for crimes that today might seem trivial. Nobles had near absolute power over their servants, and harsh punishments were considered a natural part of discipline. For a child like Elizabeth, scenes of violence were not hidden, they were lessons in authority. When she was only 11 years old, Elizabeth was betrothed to a man named Ferenc Nadasdy, another powerful Hungarian noble. This was not a marriage of love, but of power and alliance. Mad pharaohs are raged and mortal. At the age of 15, she married him and moved into his family's vast fortress, Szeged Castle, which would later become infamous as the stage for her alleged crimes. Ferenc Nadasdy was known as the Black Knight of Hungary. A warrior feared by the Ottomans, he spent much of his life on the battlefield, leaving Elizabeth to manage the estates and servants in his absence. This gave her unusual authority for a woman of her time. She controlled land, money, and people, power that few women in Europe could ever hope to possess. At first glance, Elizabeth's life seemed perfect. A wealthy marriage, a strong bloodline, and the loyalty of her household. But beneath the surface, shadows began to grow. Her husband, while often absent, reportedly encouraged her cruelty, teaching her methods of punishing servants that were both inventive and horrifying. The fortress of Zephyros became not only a home but a place of whispers, whispers that would, in time, grow into screams. It is in this world of noble privilege, endless war, and casual cruelty that Elizabeth Bathory began to shape her legacy. Some saw her as a capable noblewoman, intelligent and respected. Others, even then, whispered of a darker side, of punishments too cruel, even for those brutal times. And as the years passed, those whispers grew louder. Young girls began to vanish. Servants feared their mistress more than the enemy at the gates. And the name of Elizabeth Bathory began to transform from noble countess into something monstrous. The first whispers of Elizabeth Bathory's cruelty began quietly, almost invisibly, like cracks spreading through stone. At first, they were only rumors, muttered among peasants and servants who dared not speak too loudly. But over time, these whispers turned into cries of horror. Life at Szeged Castle was strict and merciless. Elizabeth demanded absolute obedience, and those who failed her expectations paid a terrible price. Servants recalled how punishments could be savage, a slap, a beating, or worse. But what truly terrified them were the punishments that went beyond discipline, punishments that seemed to take pleasure in pain. It is said that Elizabeth enjoyed experimenting with new forms of cruelty. If a servant girl burned bread in the kitchen, Elizabeth might press a burning iron to her skin. If a maid was too slow in her duties, Elizabeth might stab her with needles, or cover her in honey and leave her outside to be tormented by insects. These were not acts of correction, they were acts of terror. Soon, villagers began to notice something even darker. Young girls were vanishing. Many of them were peasants who had been promised work at the castle, safe employment in exchange for their labor. Families, desperate for survival, sent their daughters willingly, believing they would be protected within the fortress of the noble Bathory family. Instead, these daughters never returned. At first, their disappearances were dismissed. The kingdom was a dangerous place. Wars, diseases, and bandits claimed lives constantly. But as the numbers grew, suspicions became harder to ignore. Whispers spread. The Countess was doing something unspeakable to these girls. One of the most enduring legends claims that Elizabeth began killing not only to punish, but for a darker reason: vanity. According to these tales, she believed that bathing in the blood of virgins would preserve her youth and beauty. Servants swore they had seen her hands stained enshrined, her gowns splattered with blood, her chambers echoing with screams. Historians today debate how much of this legend is true. The story of bathing in blood may have been an exaggeration, twisted over the years to make Elizabeth seem more monstrous, more inhuman. But there was little doubt that something terrible was happening within those castle walls. Too many witnesses spoke of corpses, of broken bodies, of the terrifying cruelty that seemed to pour from Elizabeth's soul. Even her husband, Ferenc Nardesti, was said to encourage her violence. When he returned from battle, he reportedly shared his own cruel methods of torture, passing them on as if they were secrets of war. The two of them, husband and wife, may have been bound not only by power and marriage, but also by bloodlust. By the time Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth was no longer just a noble widow. She was now the undisputed master of her estates, free to act without restraint. And with his death, the rumors grew darker still. No longer bound by her husband's presence, she allegedly became even more ruthless. What had once been whispers among servants now reached the villagers beyond the castle walls. Parents warned their daughters not to accept work from the Bathorys. Priests muttered that something unholy dwelled in Cieti Castle. Yet the peasants could do little. Elizabeth was untouchable, protected by her family's power and her noble title. Still, the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. And soon, Elizabeth's name would no longer be a whispered rumor. It would become a cry for justice, echoing through the kingdom. By the early 160s, the legend of Elizabeth Bathory had taken on a life of its own. What had begun as whispers of cruelty now erupted into full-blown tales of horror. Servants spoke of nights when the castle halls echoed with screams. Villagers whispered of daughters sent to work who never returned. And yet, despite the growing fear, few dared to confront the woman who seemed untouchable, the noble widow of one of Hungary's most powerful families. With her husband, Ferenc, dead, Elizabeth ruled her estates alone. She was wealthy, connected, and protected by the influence of her family. But with this power came freedom, and, according to the testimonies later collected, she used that freedom to unleash her darkest impulses. The methods of her cruelty became infamous. Witnesses claimed she stabbed servants with needles, cut their flesh with scissors, or bit pieces from their bodies. Others spoke of girls locked in freezing cell, drenched with water until they turned into lifeless statues of ice. Some described her covering victims in oil and setting them aflame, or starving them for days until they collapsed. But the most infamous accusation was her obsession with blood. According to legend, one day a servant girl brushed Elizabeth's hair too roughly, and the Countess struck her so hard that blood splashed across her hand. When she wiped it away, she thought the skin where the blood had touched looked younger, fresher. From that moment, she became convinced that the blood of young girls was the secret to eternal youth. Thus began the most terrifying element of her legend, the blood baths. Servants swore they had seen her draining girls of their blood, collecting it in basins, and even bathing in it to preserve her beauty. Others claimed she smeared it on her skin as if it were a magical lotion. Whether or not this was true, the stories spread like wildfire. Cementing her reputation as something more than a cruel noblewoman, she became a creature of nightmare, a vampire in human form. How many victims fell to Elizabeth's alleged cruelty? The numbers are staggering. Some accounts suggest dozens, others hundreds. A servant girl later testified under oath that she had seen lists kept by the Countess, names of more than 600 young women who had died within her castle walls. Historians argue over the accuracy of these numbers, but even the lowest estimates suggests that Elizabeth Bathory was responsible for more deaths than almost any other serial killer in history. The victims came from many walks of life. At first, they were peasant girls, daughters of farmers, lured by the promise of employment at the castle. Families were eager to send their children into the service of a powerful noblewoman, believing it would give them safety and a chance for a better future. Instead, these girls disappeared forever. But over time, Elizabeth's hunger grew bolder. She began targeting the daughters of lesser nobles, young women of good families, invited to her castle under the promise of learning courtly manners and noble etiquette. These were not poor, forgotten peasants. These were girls with families who had influence, names that carried weight. And when they, too, vanished, the whispers grew into accusations that could no longer be ignored. Even those closest to her began to break. Some servants, terrified of sharing their mistress's fate, escaped and told stories of the horrors they had seen. Priests who visited the castle recorded finding bodies or being warned to stay silent if they valued their lives. The evidence piled up, and with it, pressure mounted on the Hungarian crown to take action. Still, Elizabeth seemed untouchable. She was a Bathory. Her family's name shielded her from punishment. For years, the nobility looked the other way, unwilling to confront one of their own. But when the daughters of noble families began to vanish, the shield cracked. Suddenly, Elizabeth's crimes could no longer be hidden behind wealth and power. The reign of terror had gone too far, and soon, the kingdom itself would turn against the Blood Countess. By the year 1610, Elizabeth Bathory's reputation had grown too dark, too dangerous to ignore. The disappearances of noble-born girls had struck at the very heart of Hungary's aristocracy. Families who once turned a blind eye to the suffering of peasants could not remain silent when their own daughters vanished into the stone walls of Széchet Castle. The Hungarian crown could no longer ignore the mounting accusations. King Matthias II himself became involved. But here was the problem. Elizabeth was not an ordinary criminal. She was a widow of one of Hungary's greatest warriors, a woman of immense wealth, and a member of one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. To openly accuse her of mass murder was not just a legal act, it was a political gamble. For this reason, the king turned to one man, György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary. Thurzó was both a trusted noble and a political ally of the crown. His task was clear: investigate Elizabeth Bathory and bring her reign of terror to an end, but do so without tearing apart the fragile stability of the kingdom. Zephyros began quietly, gathering testimonies from villagers, priests, and even runaway servants. What he heard was shocking. Witness after witness described the horrors of Zephyros' castle. Some spoke of girls found dead, their bodies mangled beyond recognition. Others described hearing screams at night or seeing bloodstains that no cleaning could erase. One of the most damning testimonies came from Elizabeth's own servants. Terrified of punishment, they confessed under questioning that they had helped their mistress carry out her acts. They described torture chambers, secret rooms where screams echoed, and Elizabeth herself watching with cold fascination as young women were beaten, burned, or drained of blood. By late December 1610, Serao had enough evidence to act. On the night of December 30th, he and his men surrounded Sietchi Castle. What they discovered inside has remained one of the most infamous moments in European history. According to reports, Zephyros' men entered the castle and found young women imprisoned within, some dead, others dying, their bodies covered in wounds. In one account, they discovered Elizabeth herself standing over a victim. Whether this dramatic scene is fact or legend, it symbolized the horror that had taken root in the castle. Elizabeth was placed under arrest, though she was never taken to a common prison. Instead, she remained confined within her own fortress, while Zephyro began preparing for the trial of her servants. The investigation uncovered chilling details. Dozens of witnesses came forward, describing the fate of the girls who entered Zephyros' castle. Some had been lured with promises of education, others simply taken from nearby villages. Their screams were said to echo in the night, yet no one dared speak until Thurzo gave them protection. As testimonies piled up, so did the numbers. Some claimed Elizabeth was responsible for the deaths of up to 650 girls, a number so immense it defied belief. Even if exaggerated, the scale of the crimes shocked Europe. But there was a delicate problem. To put Elizabeth herself on trial would mean dragging the name of the Bathory family through the mud, threatening political alliances and risking rebellion among the nobility. King Matthias and Thurzo both understood this. So, while Elizabeth's servants faced public trials, the Countess herself was spared the humiliation of the courtroom. Instead, in 1611, 4 of her closest servants were tried and convicted. Under torture, they confessed to assisting Elizabeth in her crimes. Their sentences were brutal: execution by burning or mutilation, punishments fitting for the horrors they had described. Elizabeth, however, was never executed. She was too powerful, too noble, too dangerous to condemn outright. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment, confined within the walls of her own castle, sealed away from the world she had terrorized. Yet even in her captivity, questions lingered. Was she truly guilty of hundreds of murders? Or was she the victim of a conspiracy, her crimes exaggerated, or even invented by rivals who sought her lands and wealth? What is certain is that the name of Elizabeth Bathory had become legend. She was no longer just a noblewoman. She was the Blood Countess, a symbol of horror whose reputation would outlive her body, echoing through centuries of history. The investigation into Elizabeth Bathory had shaken Hungary to its core. Never before had a noblewoman of such rank and power faced accusations of such monstrous crimes. The people demanded justice, yet the crown and the nobility walked a delicate line. To openly prosecute Elizabeth in court would mean tearing down the honor of the Bathory name, one of the most influential dynasties in Central Europe. And so, the king and his council crafted a compromise, one that delivered punishment, but shielded the aristocracy from disgrace. In January of 1611, the trial began in the town of Bitcha. But the accused were not Elizabeth herself. Instead, her closest servants and alleged accomplices stood before the court. They were the ones who had carried out her orders, the ones who they had served with other people, and they had ruled a man's word of their children. There were 4 in total: Dorothea Sentus, known as Dorka, Ilona Yor, Janos Uvari, nicknamed Fichko, and Katarina Benica. Their testimonies painted a picture of cruelty beyond comprehension. They described how Elizabeth had ordered them to beat, burn, and mutilate the girls. Some said she struck the first blow herself, while others claimed she watched with cold satisfaction as her servants carried out the punishments. Under questioning, and in some cases, under torture, they admitted to participating in the killings. The court heard shocking numbers, dozens, even hundreds of victims. The servants spoke of mass graves, of girls buried in the castle grounds, and of blood that seemed to flow endlessly within those stone walls. The sentences were swift and brutal. Fitzko, the male servant, was beheaded before his body was burned. Dorothea and Ilona had their fingers torn out with hot pincers before being thrown alive into the flames. Katerina, who was said to have played a lesser role, was sentenced to life imprisonment. These executions served as both justice and warning. The peasants saw the accomplices punished in the most terrible ways, while the nobility saw that the crown was careful not to humiliate the Bathory name by executing Elizabeth herself. Elizabeth Bathory was spared the public trial that her servants endured. To drag her into court would have meant a scandal that no noble house could endure. Instead, her punishment was decided behind closed doors. She would spend the rest of her life confined within the walls of her own fortress, Sichet Castle. But this was no ordinary imprisonment. According to legend, she was bricked into a set of rooms within the castle, the windows sealed, the doors locked, leaving only a small slit through which guards could pass food. Whether she was truly entombed in this way, or simply kept under strict guard, remains uncertain. But the image of the Blood Countess, walled alive within her own castle, has haunted imaginations for centuries. For 4 years, Elizabeth remained in captivity. Her wealth was seized, her power stripped away, and her name became a curse whispered across the kingdom. Once one of the most feared and respected women in Hungary, she was reduced to a prisoner in the very place where she had ruled with terror. On August 21st, 164, Elizabeth Bathory was found dead in her chamber. She was 54 years old. Accounts say that on the night before her death, she complained to her guards that her hands were cold. By morning, she was gone. Her body was buried in the church at Sietze, but the local villagers, outraged at the idea of her resting among them, demanded her remains be removed. To this day, the exact location of her final resting place remains unknown. Some say she was moved to the Bathory family crypt, others that her body was hidden to prevent desecration. In either case, the woman who had once bathed in wealth and power left the world in silence and shame. The trial and imprisonment of Elizabeth Bathory did not silence her story. If anything, it gave it new life. The horrifying testimonies, the tales of bloodbaths, the image of a countess bricked into her castle walls, all of it transformed her from a historical figure into a legend. She was no longer just a Hungarian noblewoman. She became the Blood Countess, the first female serial killer in recorded history, a symbol of aristocratic cruelty and the darkest side of human desire. And yet, questions linger. Was she truly guilty of hundreds of murders? Or was she a powerful widow, targeted by men who coveted her lands and influence? The truth, buried under centuries of rumor and propaganda, may never fully be known. But one thing is certain: Elizabeth Bathory's name will forever remain carved into history as one of the most terrifying women who ever lived. The death of Elizabeth Bathory in 1614 should have closed the chapter on her life. Yet, in many ways, it was only the beginning of her legend. In the centuries that followed, the stories surrounding her grew darker, stranger, and more fantastical, until she became less a historical figure and more a creature of myth. The most infamous tale connected to Elizabeth is that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. This image has haunted European folklore for more than 400 years. It is gruesome, theatrical, and unforgettable, but historians now agree that it may not have been true. No written testimony from her trial explicitly mentions bloodbaths. Instead, This detail appears later, as rumors expanded her crimes into something more supernatural. It is possible that the image of a noblewoman obsessed with beauty was exaggerated into a horror story, a countess who literally drowned herself in the blood of the innocent. Still, the story persisted because it fit so perfectly with the fears of the time. Women who sought power were often demonized, painted as witches or monsters. A wealthy widow like Elizabeth, strong, independent, and feared, was the perfect target for legends of unnatural cruelty. It is no coincidence that Elizabeth Bathory is often mentioned in the same breath as Dracula. While Bram Stoker's famous vampire novel was inspired by Vlad the Impaler, the myth of a noble figure feeding on the blood of the innocent bears striking resemblance to Elizabeth's legend. Some folklorists believe she directly influenced the European vampire myth. The image of a woman rejuvenating herself with blood, living within a gloomy castle, and preying on the young connects her story to the archetype of the vampire countess, a figure that still appears in horror fiction today. Indeed, in many cultures, Elizabeth is remembered not as a historical criminal, but as a supernatural being. To Hungarians, she is Elizabeth Bathory. To Slovaks, she is the Cursed Lady of Szekely Castle. To modern horror fans, she is simply the Blood Countess, a woman who straddles the line between reality and nightmare. Yet, for all the horror and fascination, scholars still debate the truth of Elizabeth's crimes. Was she truly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of young women? Or was she the victim of a political conspiracy designed to strip her of power and wealth? There are several reasons to doubt the traditional story. For one, the number of victims, 650, is impossibly high for the time and place. Even with her power, hiding that many murders would have been almost impossible. Furthermore, much of the testimony against her came from servants who were tortured into confession. How much of their stories can be trusted? Some historians argue that Elizabeth was the victim of greed. As a wealthy widow with no husband to protect her, she was vulnerable. The king himself, Matthias II, owed her a large debt. By accusing her of crimes and seizing her estates, he conveniently erased what he owed. Others believe her political enemies simply used rumors of her cruelty, exaggerated or invented, to destroy her reputation and remove her from power. Still, there is evidence that cannot be ignored. Witnesses did describe bodies, mutilations, and screams within the castle walls. The deaths of young servant girls were real, even if the numbers were inflated. Whether she killed dozens or hundreds, the horror remains undeniable. What makes Elizabeth Bathory so haunting is that she was not a peasant or a common criminal. She was a noblewoman, educated, wealthy, and powerful, someone who should have been remembered for her intelligence and influence. Instead, her legacy is one of blood and cruelty. Perhaps that is why her story continues to fascinate. She represents the fear that power corrupts absolutely, that behind the walls of wealth and privilege, unimaginable horrors can unfold. She also embodies the age-old suspicion of women in power, demonized for stepping beyond the roles society demanded of them. So, who is Elizabeth Bathory, truly? Was she a mass murderer, reveling in the suffering of the innocent? Or was she a victim of politics, her reputation twisted into something monstrous by those who stood to gain from her downfall? The truth may never be known. What remains is the legend. The Blood Countess, the woman who bathed in blood, the first female serial killer. And perhaps that is the final horror of Elizabeth Bathory's story, that we will never know where fact ends and myth begins. When Elizabeth Bathory was sealed inside the walls of her castle in 1610, No one could have predicted that she would become one of the most infamous figures in European history. 4 centuries later, her name still evokes images of cruelty, blood, and Gothic terror. Beyond the gruesome details of her alleged crimes, her story has left a powerful cultural legacy, one that continues to shape literature, film, and the way we think about power, gender, and evil. For historians, Elizabeth became a cautionary tale about unchecked authority. Whether she killed hundreds of girls or far fewer, her case highlighted the dangers of absolute power in the hands of the nobility. In her world, peasants and servant girls were disposable, and few dared question a woman of her rank. The supposed bloodshed at Sefyet Castle symbolized the fragility of life for the powerless, trapped beneath the whims of the rich. At the same time, her downfall also revealed the limits of aristocratic privilege. For centuries, nobles had been nearly untouchable, immune to the same punishments that peasants faced. Elizabeth's arrest and lifetime imprisonment marked a rare moment when the law struck against a woman of her stature. It was both shocking and symbolic. Even the mighty could fall. Her legend soon escaped the pages of history and entered the world of literature. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when Gothic fiction flourished, she became an ideal inspiration for writers searching for dark, mysterious villains. The image of a beautiful noblewoman, sustaining her youth by bathing in blood, fed perfectly into Gothic tropes of decadence, corruption, and supernatural evil. Writers and playwrights across Europe began to weave her into their stories. In many retellings, she was transformed into a vampire-like figure, more myth than human. By the time Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, Elizabeth's legend had already contributed to the European imagination of blood-drinking aristocrats lurking in castles. While Dracula drew directly from Vlad the Impaler, the image of a noble predator feeding on the young owes much to the legacy of the Blood Countess. It sounds funny. In the 20th century, Elizabeth's legend firmly merged with the vampire mythos. Films and novels often recast her as a vampiric figure, cursed to feed on blood in order to survive. She became the archetype of the vampire countess, seductive, elegant, and terrifying. Unlike Doctrilla, who represented masculine brutality, Elizabeth symbolized feminine allure, corrupted into horror. From Hammer horror films to modern television shows, she has appeared under many names, but always with the same chilling essence: a woman whose beauty is maintained by blood. In some depictions, she is a tragic figure, cursed by her vanity. In others, she is a merciless predator, reveling in her cruelty. Either way, she continues to fascinate because she embodies a combination of glamour and terror that few villains can match. Beyond fiction, Elizabeth Bathory has also become a cultural symbol of female power and the fears it inspires. In patriarchal societies, powerful women have often been portrayed as unnatural, dangerous, or demonic. Elizabeth's legend fits this pattern. Her intelligence, independence, and authority set her apart from most women of her age. Instead of being remembered as a political leader or a wealthy widow managing vast estates, she was immortalized as a monster. Some modern scholars see her story as a warning about how history demonizes powerful women. Just as queens and noble women were accused of witchcraft in the early modern era, Elizabeth was cast as a bloodthirsty killer. Whether or not she committed her alleged crimes, the way she was remembered reflects centuries of fear about women who defy expectations. Today, Elizabeth Bathory is everywhere in popular culture. She has inspired novels, plays, operas, heavy metal songs, and even video games. From dark fantasy series to true crime documentaries, her image endures as a symbol of cruelty and horror. In Slovakia, where Sephiroth's castle still stands, her story has become a source of both tourism and unease. Visitors walk through ruins of her prison, imagining the screams of victims that may or may not have echoed there centuries ago. In Hungary, she remains a contested figure, a national shame for some, a misunderstood victim for others. Her story, some may seem to convince me, everything from the world embarrassment and private. Ultimately, Elizabeth Bathory's greatest legacy is the immortality of her name. Few figures in history have inspired such a blend of fact and fiction. She is remembered alongside Jack the Ripper, Vlad the Impaler, and Gilles de Rais, not simply as a criminal, but as a cultural icon of evil. The truth of her life may forever remain uncertain, but her story has transcended history to become myth. She is not just a figure of the past, she is a character who still haunts our collective imagination. Elizabeth Bathory may have died in 1614, bricked into her castle chamber, but her legend lives on. Every book, film, and story retold about her is another drop of blood added to the river of myth that keeps her alive. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all, that a woman accused of unspeakable crimes achieved the one thing she is most remembered for: immortality. More than 400 years have passed since Elizabeth Bathory took her last breath, confined within the stone walls of her castle. The world she lived in has long vanished. The feudal estates, the constant wars with the Ottomans, the rigid structures of aristocratic power. And yet her name remains, whispered with fascination and dread, carrying a weight that few historical figures ever achieve. She is remembered as the Blood Countess, a woman whose cruelty was said to stain the earth itself. For some, she is the ultimate warning about the corruption of unchecked power, the embodiment of what happens when privilege allows a human being to become a predator. For others, she is a symbol of injustice, a victim of a conspiracy, condemned not only by her political enemies, but by centuries of rumor and legend that turned her into something more than human. This duality is what makes her story so enduring. Well, in spite of that, had you seen the moods that turned him into something more than human?
Elizabeth Bathory exists in two worlds at once. In one, she is a murderer, luring servant girls into her castle, torturing them, and discarding their bodies without mercy. In the other, she is a woman crushed by forces larger than herself, transformed into a monster by men who profited from her downfall. The truth lies somewhere between, but we will never know where. The records of her trial are fragmented, the testimonies tainted by torture, the numbers exaggerated beyond belief. What remains is a shadow, a blurred figure whose reality has been lost to time.
And perhaps that is why she continues to haunt us. Humanity is drawn to mysteries that resist resolution, to figures who blur the line between fact and myth. We may never uncover who Elizabeth Bathory truly was, but that uncertainty has allowed her to live on in ways few others have. She has become a character, a symbol, a ghost that drifts through history books and horror novels, through opera stages and video game screens. Her story reminds us of the fragility of reputation, of how easily truth can be drowned by fear, rumor, and politics. It also reminds us that history is not always written to preserve facts, but to serve power. Elizabeth Bathory's life, whatever it may have truly been, was twisted into a tale so dark and so captivating that the world could not look away. In the end, she achieved the one thing she is most remembered for: immortality. Not the kind promised by bloodbaths or youth preserved through cruelty, but the immortality of legend. She has joined the ranks of Dracula and Jack the Ripper, names that will echo as long as humanity tells stories of monsters, both real and imagined. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: whether she was guilty or not, Elizabeth Bathory still wins. We speak her name, we tell her story, we keep her alive.
And every retelling, every whisper, every shiver at the thought of the Blood Countess gives her what she desired more than anything else: a life that never ends.